and welcome to this webinar that has been put together under the program called the Development Corridors Partnership. This program is funded by the UK Research Institute and funded through WCMC, but implemented in Kenya by the African Conservation Center and the University of Sorry, I think I may have gone off briefly. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So we welcome you to this 1-hour session where we are going to interrogate the background to the impacts of infrastructure on development. In East Africa today, we know, as the video has very ably shown, there's lots of development projects. And a lot of these are having multiple cumulative impacts at different levels: social, economic, environmental. And through this program with the African Conservation Center and the Institute of Climate Change Adaptation in University of Nairobi, we invite you to this session, which will share the highlights of our work, followed by a panel discussion, and then an open forum where we will explore solutions for deploying sustainable development in East Africa. And we've been running this as a webinar series of different research outcomes, and this is the series we're beginning with in this September. So my name is Lucy Waruingi, the Executive Director of the African Conservation Center and a co-PI on the project. And we hope that by showcasing some of the research outcomes of the work we have been doing, we will give you a sense of what the findings are showing, but also give us an opportunity to engage in better collaboration in improving linear infrastructure, so that the infrastructure we develop as a country, as a region, as a continent is truly sustainable in every sense of the word. And we also aim to collaborate more closely with practitioners, with investors, with policymakers, so that we can drive impact and create realistic solutions for the changing development space in Africa. So our main presenter today will be Dr. Tobias Nyumba. He's the project coordinator on this project at the African Conservation Center. He's also a postdoctoral scientist at the University of Nairobi, and he led a process of doing a research on environmental safeguards for linear infrastructure. And we have a great panel that's going to be part of this discussion. But let me start with a bit of housekeeping, even as we begin. First, to say that this meeting is being recorded, and it would be important that you let us know if you have any issues with this, but only the presentation and the initial panel discussions will be publicly available, not the open Q&A at the end. Your microphone will remain muted and your camera will be off during the webinar, but if you would like to comment or ask a question, please type it in the chat function through the presentation time and on the panel, and your questions will be addressed to a particular speaker. If you have any technical issues, please feel free to send a direct message to the user. You can see they are listed as technical support, and Laura will be able to sort you out very quickly. So I would like to first introduce our main presenter, Dr. Tobias Nyumba, who has been working on this project. And even as we introduce him, he has a PhD from University of Cambridge in geography, and is really interested in the interface of development and conservation. But we'd also like to hear from you, and even before we start, in understanding what your views are on the public participation process of the ESIA that is deployed every time we have development projects. And I will have the question come up on the screen. And here is the question. Your answer will be anonymous. The question is, from where you are, wherever you're coming from, what are the barriers to public participation in the ESIA process in the development projects in your country? So mention your country and mention what are the barriers. If you can just type in your response, we'll be able to sample what the main responses are. Your country and what are the main barriers. I don't know, Tanya, if you'd like to give instructions. People need to get online to www.menti.com. When you do that and type in the code 67749230, you will get the screen that I'm looking at. So using your phone or your device, go to www.menti.com and type in the code 67749230, and the question will show up on what are the barriers to public participation in the ESIA process. Type in your own country and what your barrier is. Thank you. We're already getting some responses. So we'll wait until most of those in the audience are able to log in and to respond. If you have any challenges technically, do send a message to technical support. Thank you for those who are already submitting their responses. We have so far South Africa, there's limited accessibility to the public participation process in rural communities. Thank you. In Kenya, lack of education and awareness and political goodwill. Also in Kenya, lack of awareness. A lot is done on paper, but not in practice. In UK, people often disengaged with the local community. Kenya also, that the barriers are low levels of awareness on the process itself or the importance of the process. There's also lack of empowerment and poverty among the communities that are meant to engage. And so they have other overriding concerns. Thank you for those responses. Zimbabwe, that the ESIA process and laws. Kenya, lack of true accountability. Let's keep those coming in. I think I also saw something in the chat. Someone says in Kenya, political influence. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts? Kenya, getting public participant attendance to turn up in the rural areas can be difficult. That's very true. No government support. Any other thoughts? All right, there's also an input in French. Unfortunately, I will not be able to translate, but maybe if someone can, they could. He says he's from the Republic of Congo. I can decipher a bit. The obstacles to population is a population, I think it's a challenge in communication about the enterprises of the population, the enterprises that are within the population. Sorry if I'm not interpreting that right, but we can have someone clarify that. In Kenya also, limited follow-up on the implementation of the ESIA recommendations. Great responses. Thank you for this input. Japan, low level of awareness among communities, low incentive. Kenya, unclear policy guidelines. Uganda, delay in approval of EIA, lack of public consultations in Bulgaria, lack of awareness and involvement. I think we're seeing a lot of common areas that are showing up in terms of awareness, in terms of information and knowledge, in terms of communities and people not being fully able to participate, either because of access to the sites or understanding of the issue at hand, gaps in policy guidelines. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll close the Menti here. For now, we'll have another opportunity later on to also look into the same, different questions that are related. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists so that we know who's going to be on the panel before Tobias takes over the floor. And I might ask Tanya or Laura if you could help me by putting up the profiles. I don't actually have that in front of me, and I wanted to introduce our three panelists. Okay, I have it, thank you. I have Mrs. Stellah Ndiwa. She's the Senior Environmental Officer from Kenya Railways. And as you know, they have been at the forefront of some of the very significant developments in this country. We have Ms. Linda Munyao, who is the Vice Chair of the Environment Institute of Kenya, and they oversight all the EIA experts who are registered in this country. And we also have Ms. Marian Kioka, who's joining us from NEMA. She is the Director in charge of EIA compliance. So we have the right people in the panelists who will be able to both interrogate the findings of the research that will be shared, but also answer some of your questions. And our goal is to find ways of collaborating more effectively and addressing the gaps and the challenges that will emerge after today's session. So thank you and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the panelists. I'll now hand over to Tobias to give us his presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. So welcome everybody from wherever you're joining us. Lucy, confirm that my screen is visible. Then I can proceed.
Yes, we can see and hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, I think just a quick overview from the the responses to the Menti survey. I think there's a lot of commonalities, and what I'll be talking about today might be unique to Kenya, but you will realize by the end of the day that it's shared across the globe, particularly insofar as community participation is concerned. And as we will see, this remains to be one of the most important components of the environmental safeguards, as it is actually meant to safeguard both the social and ecological components of the society when you look at it from an socio-ecological perspective. Thank you. All right, so what I'll be talking about is basically a major component of the work we've done, and this is some work that we did in the field, talking to communities and physically visiting some of the components of these projects to see how they are performing currently, and linking that with the process of the environmental and social impact assessment that was meant to really establish some of these impacts at the very beginning of the project. So because the focus is on the public, so basically I think it's good that we all share a common understanding of what the public means in the context of this piece of work. And so in our understanding, or for today's purposes, I'll simply say that when we talk about public, we are referring to more natural or legal persons. So basically somebody who has got the legality or legal identity to really engage within the country, but also they are naturally born here and they are able to do that. But also it goes beyond that to look at some of the shifting interests. So that now takes us to the perspective of a community, because when we talk about community engagement, we also think about what do they bring onto the table, what are their ideologies, what are their values, and how can this be incorporated in the process. So we also look at some individuals who are interested in the decision-making process other than the proponent of a project. So most of the time we say this project involves so many people, but sometimes the focus is on the owners of that project. So in our case, we are also looking at other external individuals who are interested in the decision process of that project, other than those who are with the responsibility and also those with the authority to manage or run some of these projects. Beyond that, we're also looking at some of the individuals or general public that is involved either as individuals or as members. So in this case, a good example we've been dealing with is the Conservation Alliance of Kenya. There is the Environment Institute of Kenya. So these are institutions that are brought together individuals with similar interests or similar ideologies and values. And so they don't act as individuals, but they now act as a collection of individuals under an umbrella organization. The assumption is that their views and values then speak to the individuality within them. Beyond that, we also look at a situation where people who are getting interested in a certain project by virtue of their proximity to that project. So we talk about communities living within the proximity of the SGR or within the proximity of the LAPSSET, and maybe for the natural resources, the forest and park adjacent communities. So by virtue of their proximity to these projects, they then become members of the public with vested interests. Look at the economics, the social and environmental issues and values that really tie them to those kind of processes or those kind of projects, make them peoples of interest. But also beyond that, we also talk much about stakeholders. And this is a very interesting one because every public function we are told about stakeholder engagement. I think as DCP, we did hold a stakeholder workshop at the beginning. And this now goes beyond the general public, but now it encompasses even those who live far away, like all of you are attending this webinar today from different parts of the world to hear about the SGR in Kenya, which is a matter of global interest. So it doesn't really talk about the public by virtue of proximity or direct impact, but also those who are interested in learning more or understanding more about the specific project, or an organization that's really interested in getting involved in future or learning lessons from the current implementation to be able to do that in their own areas. The beauty about stakeholders, and in this case, is that they might not necessarily have an influence in how that project is rolled through, but at least their presence then provides an opportunity for accountability. That's why when we talk about the environmental and social impact assessment under the consultation banner, we talk about a wider consultation. Not all of us have got all the lessons that we need to learn within that specific area. Public participation is increasingly becoming critical in conservation, development, and policy engagement, as we've seen with examples, globally, donors, different governments, international organizations are all advocating for the involvement of the public, particularly where these projects are deemed to have direct or indirect impact. And this can be positive or negative. The purpose of some of these projects is supposed to improve their well-being, improve their socioeconomic status, and therefore they need to have a stake. So we try to avoid the top-bottom approach to development and policy, development, but encourage the bottom-up and general participation. In Kenya, the government has provided opportunities through the Constitution of Kenya 2010 that advocates for public involvement and participation in different spheres of policy formulation, development, and implementation, particularly within the devolved systems of governance. So within the county governments, there's always the need for participation in the budget formulation when it comes to the formulation of different development agenda, or like the ones they have now, the county development programs, budgetary processes. And so when it comes to environmental governance, well, they are also called upon to do that. And this has further been entrenched in the national regulations through the Environmental Management and Coordination Act 99 and reviewed in 2015, which then takes this to more specifically look at the social and environmental security and has provided various guidelines to really make this more feasible and provide for meaningful participation of the public in the entire process of environmental decision making. Outside the government spheres, we have got the civil society, like I mentioned, the Conservation Alliance of Kenya, the Environment Institute of Kenya, and several others that have also developed mechanisms to ensure that the public is empowered to participate. The beauty with the civil society is that the central theme there is community or public empowerment to ensure that they demand, for example, accountability, they demand transparency and inclusivity in the process of public decision-making and implementation of these programs. And what this has done is it has enabled the general public to overcome challenges or barriers to public engagement, particularly where they were traditionally excluded in project decision making. And that's why you see today, as we'll be seeing, the process of the EIA for the SGR project and LAPSSET projects, which are mainstream government projects, were really put to test by the agitations from the civil society to demand for accountability and the empowerment from the local communities to ensure that they were able to participate. Beyond that, then the civil society also has some of the resources to mobilize for local communities to demand accountability over these development projects, either through capacity building, education and awareness, but also ensuring that some of the information that might not have reached them is actually made available. With specific reference to development projects, then public participation is quite important, particularly to ensure that communities, different sectors of the society are able to build some trust in these projects, but also to minimize conflicts. As we'll see, when that doesn't exist, then at the time of implementation of these projects, we have a situation where people, demonstrate. There's a lot of antagonism, and some of the projects are delayed because of, conflicts between different interested groups. But also it enhances transparency and accountability because people realize that there's somebody watching, and so they have to do things the proper way. It also affords adequate opportunity to raise concerns, share knowledge and experiences. So what we know, I think now we are all aware when we talk about indigenous versus scientific knowledge, most of the communities have survived decades in their local environment because of their own indigenous knowledge and awareness on how they can survive. So for us as external developers, we are called upon therefore to ensure that we discuss this with them and learn from their experiences, but also build on their knowledge to ensure that we don't create projects that are really alien to some of these local environments. So participation then gives us that opportunity to engage on both sides of the spectrum. It also offers an opportunity to educate stakeholders and also increase the awareness. What we see, for instance, is where people simply stand aside and they watch a project being implemented, and so they simply have got no idea what their roles might be in that project, what are the potential benefits, and what are the potential costs. And so they become spectators in a project that is meant to be for the public benefit. Through public participation forums, they are able to understand and appreciate really what the project is all about, but also become part and parcel of that implementation. And finally, it legitimizes public decisions. Because in order to avoid complaining and antagonisms between the communities and publics and the government, then whenever they are involved and they give an okay to a project to proceed, then the government of the day has the confidence that they have the support of the people. And so there's that legitimacy to ensure that the project being implemented on behalf of the people has got the people's blessings. We will see how those might have played or not in public in the Kenyan case, but that should actually be the driving force behind public participation. Within the environmental sector, public participation has already been incorporated, particularly for these major projects like the SGR, the LAPSSET, the dams, under the Environmental Management and Coordination Act that emphasizes public participation. But beyond that, there's also the international, different regulations and conventions that actually emphasize public participation when it comes to environmental accountability, the likes of Aarhus Convention, the Convention on Environmental Impact Assessment in a transboundary context, Principle 17 of the Agenda 21, as well as the Convention on Access to Information of 1998. So all these have been domesticated in our case, and they have been incorporated in one way or the other under the MCA. And we then expect all the actors in the field to ensure that in one way or the other, they are able to implement. Pretty fast, I look at, some of us are already familiar with this, but the history of EIAs, I think this goes beyond the Kenyan boundaries to the 1960s, when people started really getting more and more entrenched in understanding the relationship between development and environment. And so a lot of environmental awareness started cropping in. And I think the very first regulations emerged in the US in the late 1960s, sorry, where they created the NEPA law, and that really provided a platform for other countries to follow. So that in the mid 70s, we had a lot of high income countries already starting to entrench environmental considerations in their regulations to ensure these projects were environmentally sustainable but also responsible. But then beyond that, in other developing countries that were much closer to the developed countries, started seeing the benefits of these regulations and incorporated in their systems, like in Colombia and Philippines. However, in the 80s, when the World Bank then realized how important it was for project sustainability, they then adopted the environmental impact assessment as part of their requirements for funding some of the major development projects. And you will recall that during that period, there was a lot of environmental agitation across the globe, and most of the developing, international and multilateral funders were then called upon to express more responsibility by demanding for environmental, concerns whenever they were funding these projects. For Kenya then, around the 90s, the agitation reached fever pitch. And so, like other countries, there was need then to entrench some of these requirements in law. And so in the 90s, we started the process of having the environmental impact assessment legislation. And this culminated in the MCA Act of 1999 that has then been revised in 2015, and the environmental impact assessment and audit regulations in 2003. So technically, Kenya really is in league with the international requirements and in the international practice when it comes to environmental and social safeguards in regards to implementation of major projects. Now, the main component or the main emphasis of the EIA then is public participation, and therefore that really becomes the core of our discussion today, of which, sorry, I don't think it's moved. Just a minute. Oh, so my screen was stuck at a point. I don't think it moved. So yeah, now it's moving, yeah. So as I mentioned, the main concern is public participation. And if you look at the figure on the side of the screen, it actually highlights different areas where, public participation is required. And you'll realize that, in that entire process, from the proposal identification up to the very last point where the implementation and follow-up is conducted, it all calls for public participation in different formats. And like considering what we have defined public to be, it means it doesn't mean that we have the local community on the ground really being invited at every single section of that work, but then being clear and prudent in identifying what segment of community really gets involved in what section of that work. But the bottom line is this emphasis of public involvement from the very beginning. And the benefit of this is it then gives us the opportunity to identify, predict, evaluate, and mitigate some of the possible impacts of these projects on the environment, as well as the social systems of the community. The beauty of that is that the identification is not done externally, but it is done together with and in collaboration with the local communities, building on their indigenous knowledge. In Kenya, we then have got two major projects that have been implemented. That's the LAPSSET and the SGR projects. And these are major flagship projects in the Kenya that are entrenched in the Vision 2030 development agenda. And so we usually say they have a higher political premium. The government will then mobilize all the resources available to ensure that these projects are implemented to their full extent. In the process of doing that, there are issues that might go wrong that we will see, but then the most important thing is that they then become major investment projects, with the LAPSSET looking at around $16.1 billion US, and it involves a lot of other projects like the Lamu Port, the railway line, which was about over 1,000 kilometers, the road networks, oil pipelines, oil refineries, dual carriageways, airports, and resort cities, particularly in northern Kenya, around Isiolo and Turkana. SGR, on the other side, has been built to have cost approximately $3.8 billion US. And of course, it was initially aimed at constructing about 1,450 kilometers of railway, but that has not been accomplished, as you will realize. It's actually gone nearly half of that and stopped somewhere in Suswa, but it's still work in progress, so to say. Other projects under the SGR include, the major highways that were to link different stations, water transfer projects, and then we've got the Konza Techno City just outside Nairobi city that was also supposed to offer a bit of, to act like an ICT center and offer connectivity in the country. So those were all projects that were meant to fall under those two major projects. And by virtue of their, size alone, they were then subjected to environmental impact assessments. As we'll see, other issues really emerged. And thank you. So now the question that I was going to ask is, why then did we have to subject these projects to the environmental and social impact assessments? It's because these projects really are very big in the country and they traverse some of the key biodiversity areas. And that means they are prone to result to a lot of social impacts that include, affecting those habitats, affecting wildlife, affecting communities, because they were also traversing community and private conservancies in northern Kenya and also across the southern landscape. But also they traverse some of the key water towers in the country, and that means they were going to affect surface and groundwater resources, degrading some of the watersheds, and also resulting in the increased water demand as a result of the increasing populations along the SGR and along the LAPSSET corridor, and that might result or would result in water scarcity. Beyond that, the fact that they are running through some of the remote and fragile ecosystems that are characterized by poor population and marginalized communities means that they were already putting some of the livelihoods of these local communities at risk. And so there was always the need to ensure that these were identified early enough and mitigation measures were put in place. But beyond that, by also virtue of their coverage alone, they involved a lot of stakeholders. And so there was always going to be conflict between people, conflict between institutions, and that might also impact on its implementation, which by extension would mean that adherence to some of the environmental and social impact mitigation recommendations might actually be overlooked. But specifically, we were concerned because the evidence we've got at the moment shows that some of these three projects were actually subjected to environmental and social impact assessments, and the reports are there to provide credence to this. There are lots of images, there are lots of records, including lists of participants that have been submitted to provide evidence that actually the EIAs were conducted in the case of the SGR, and the strategic environmental impact assessment was conducted in the case of the LAPSSET. However, a lot of controversy has arisen. The public opinion is always divided on this. And as you could see from lots of those captions, demonstrations across the country during the time of implementation, leadership of different communities coming up and protesting or distancing themselves from the project is a clear demonstration that something didn't go on well at the very beginning, and that brought us into questioning whether the EIA process was conducted the way it should have been. So one of the things we did at DCP was then to explore the application of the public participation principles in the project, both in practice, but also compare that with the recommended processes under the NEMA and the international best practice. That's by the International Association for Impact Assessment. But also beyond that, we also had to speak to communities that were demonstrating or agitating and really get their perception and their attitudes or rather opinion when it comes to participation and whether they felt it was really adequate, inclusive, and whether it addressed some of their concerns. So in doing that, we actually visited these communities, starting from the coastal city of Mombasa, all the way to Suswa. And then we selected Isiolo as one of the key areas because that's where some of the LAPSSET projects had already been implemented, like the completion of the Isiolo airport, but also a number of projects running from Isiolo. The highway from Isiolo up to Marsabit was already completed and was running. And of course, there were already complaints about the community conservancies being targets for some of the expansion of this corridor. So there was already opportunity to try and engage with communities to really learn what their experiences were. So beyond that, then some of the critical findings were that, number one, despite the fact that the EIAs were conducted and that these projects were already ongoing, we had already started witnessing some of the impacts, and some of which clearly needed to have been identified and mitigated at the onset, particularly when it came to biodiversity and their ecosystems, as well as land use and land resources. So those were the two areas we really found having been impacted a lot. Water resources did feature much, but that was because within LAPSSET, we only focused on Isiolo, and that's where there's a lot of water stress issues. And so you'll realize that water issues were really prominent when it came to the LAPSSET corridor. But for the biodiversity and land use, we found this across the entire spectrum, and that really spoke to what the potential impacts would be as well when the LAPSSET was completed. In particular, under land, there were concerns about the displacement or eviction of some of the vulnerable people along the corridor, but also increase in land prices. And that meant that local communities who are poor were by effect going to be excluded or would be forced to relocate to other areas because they were no longer going to manage to compete effectively with the new arrivals. Within the ecosystem systems, the issues of the habitat for biodiversity being degraded and fragmented was quite open. I think we are all familiar now with what happened in the Savo ecosystem, being divided into two and with the embankments blocking movement of wildlife. But also within Nairobi National Park, although it's been raised, but naturally the activities there have meant that some of the wildlife that are sensitive to human presence and noise have actually avoided some of those areas. So we have got that entire habitat shrinking, but also wildlife avoiding that. And when they do that through avoidance, that means they move into the peripheries of these protected areas. And we had cases of human-wildlife conflict increasing in some of those park adjacent communities. So those, in a nutshell, those are some of the things that were already emerging as at the time of conducting our fieldwork, and we've not had a chance, to really learn whether they are going down or not. We've actually had a lot of, issues rising. The picture on the screen shows flooding along the SGR in Suswa, and that was just one of them that we've demonstrated. In one of the papers we published, we actually accounted for a spectrum of some of these impacts on land use and land resources across the entire landscape. So mitigation of some of these things wasn't included effectively, and we've got communities losing agricultural land. So
Tobias, you have about 2 more minutes.
Thank you. So in terms of public opinion, whether this participation was effective, of course, one thing we learned was that overall community participation in public participation in community projects, consultation process is pretty low. You would see that across the entire spectrum, nearly the percentages of those who say they have never participated, generally within the EIA over the last period of time, or even expecting to participate in future, is quite high. So that means for those of us who are advocating for public awareness and participation, we have to think critically how we are going to change that and ensure that people really understand whether, when they need and how they need to participate. For the EIA specifically, most of the participation was restricted to the pre-feasibility stages, which in most cases they stated was only an educational or rather an information session. They were called upon and were instructed or told that the government is planning to do certain things, put up the SGR, and it will benefit the communities. Beyond that, the actual data collection and learning from communities was now quite minimal, as you'd see. From 74%, the next high state of participation was at 12%. So in terms of participation in the entire spectrum, we are really concerned that communities were really left out. In terms of comparing how this was done with the recommended EIA processes, again, there's a lot of concern. In a nutshell, our finding was that the EIA for the SGR, both 1 and 2, really didn't conform with the requirements. There was a lot of issues that were overlooked, right from the engagement of the stakeholders, sharing the information, time of participation, compilation of the report, but also contextualizing the process, ensuring that the process really matched the way communities engaged in their public forums to ensure that they were able to engage effectively. On the other side, for the LAPSSET, which engaged in the strategic impact assessment, there was a bit of conformity in certain areas, particularly when they focused on the rights and resource user groups, other than just inviting communities at large. But also the way they compiled their report was quite interesting because they engaged with the stakeholders before the EIA process was conducted. When they were compiling the report, there was a feedback session to ensure that the community was aware, was also in agreement of the way the report was compiled. But for both of them, the entire report was only available in one language, that is English, and that meant that those who were not able to understand had no critical role to play beyond just speaking in the public meeting. So all those need to be addressed to ensure we are able to tackle that. As a result, we then felt that the attitudes and support of communities will dwindle. And as you could see, we asked several questions insofar as the entire process was implemented. And you'd see there's a lot of strong disagreement with a number of our statements, which shows that the community wasn't really convinced, for example, that the values of their dependence on natural resources was critical, whether interested parties and their concerns were taken into account, whether they were given adequate opportunity to participate, and whether public participation played an important role. So those ones you'd see there's a lot of negativity, but where we expected information, particularly gathering scientific information, there's a bit of neutrality, stating that the information given to them wasn't adequate to enable them make critical decisions insofar as their participation is. To conclude, therefore, I think what we can then learn from here is that even though we have got regulations that can make this process quite effective, the process of actual implementation, insofar as public involvement is concerned, is not really having a lot of public confidence. The participation and effective involvement is not there, and therefore the mitigation of these impacts really does not really speak to what was expected, and that's why we could still see impacts to date. There's also little oversight, because the fact that we are not able to conform to the MCA requirements and the international best practice means that the oversight, ensuring that it's well regulated really still has some issues to be addressed. And so for the likes of NEMA, it means there's some work to be done there. EIK, there's some work to be done there to ensure these experts really do the right thing and follow the regulations. And finally, we need therefore to improve overall how we conduct the EIAs. And this includes, building capacities of these local communities, enhancing more transparency, but also ensuring that the stakeholders are engaged in a proper way. And this might also include relooking the policy to either, remove the responsibility for funding the process from the proponents, and then ensuring that there's an independent funding process and accountability that can really compel these, experts to complete the work. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you are able to engage going forward.
Excellent, 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 excellent. Thank you, Tobias. Evidently, you have a lot that you still had to share, but you've given us a really good, overview brush on the key findings. I think the data from that study will need to be made widely available. Thank you very much. I suppose we might want to, in the future, look for another forum where we can dig into some of those findings. But I'd like to start by asking our panelists to really come on board now. And I'm going to pull out some of the issues that have been elucidated from what Tobias has shared and combine that with some of the questions that are on the chat and ask our panelists to respond from where they sit with the mandates they have and the expertise that they bring along. How best can we address some of the challenges that have been highlighted here? I think it is obvious we have the right frameworks, we have policies and documents, but there definitely is gaps and shortcomings in how the public engages from many facets. And I'm going to start by asking Stellah, if I can just remind everyone as I call them out, I'll remind them who they are. Stellah Ndiwa is the lead for the environmental department in the Kenya Railways. They have been very great collaborators in wanting to understand the outcomes of this research to inform their own practices as an agency that's implementing development projects. And Stellah, my question for you would be, what do you feel would be the best way to build public trust in giving feedback on the EIAs that you commission, on the projects that you're doing? How do we build the confidence and the public trust in that process? And how do we ensure that the process, we heard comments there that their values of conservation and values on dependency of the land are not are not properly articulated in the reports that the EIA experts pull out. How would you suggest we can improve on that barrier of public engagement, public participation in an effective manner that they feel they have been listened to and they feel that they can trust the process? Stellah, thank you. Your mic is off, Stellah.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, Lucy. Once again, Stellah Ndiwa from Kenya Railways. The SGR project was implemented in a EPC contract, because the contractor is the one who does the engineering, the procurement, and the construction. What the client does is wait for the completed project to be handed over to us by the EPC contractor. But since we have gaps and Kenya Railways probably did not have a direct supervision due to capacity in HR process, we hired through the contractor and a supervision team through KAEK. The supervisor is supposed to assist technically both the design and the environment and social reviewing of all the engineering aspects of the project to enable the contractor comply with the regulations that are there. We understand and we've heard that the ICCA process was not fully, public participation was not done, but again, we should ask at what stage do we involve the public or the stakeholders. We'll admit probably it's because our EIA, when the consultant was told to go on ground, is because the design was already done and we wanted to roll it out. Due to directive from above again, and second, there was a lot of political influence. So when the consultant was also to go on ground to do the EIA process, and particularly it was left for him to hand over the final product or the final EIA process to us, we understand there are some gaps that probably were not tackled well, or probably the community was not involved in some issues. And at the same time, in areas where the SGR passes the fragile biodiversity, we focused more on interagency approach. Like they are the custodians of the forest, they are the custodian of the wildlife reserve or something like that. We say KWS or KFS. So KR had that multiple multi-agency meetings, multiple multi-agency engagement to understand, like for example, the issues of underpasses. All the underpasses were given by KWS, informed us on the design that at this point, we need this number of underpasses or culverts for the wildlife to pass. What we will want more in the future SGR implementation is a more collaborative approach. We might lack that capacity, but institutions like DCP, institutions like that can give us more information are ready to help us to collaborate and involve the stakeholders. Here we mean the community, because we believe they have that traditional knowledge that we might have missed before, and putting them on board at the right time, at the right stage, so that when we implement future projects, we have incorporated all their views at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stellah, for very candid and open responses. It's very clear the barriers are at multiple levels. And it's also very clear that there are things that are not in your control in terms of where they're directed from, and to come to one operation. So let's put that, but that's an important thing we need to note, even as we work with these 8.
Okay, I see that the question is, how do we get the experts to be more sensitive to the local context? Okay, I think I'll just take that one. Let me first indicate that the EIA process in itself may not be the most perfect system for checking or for looking at potential environmental issues. But for now, as in the development context, it is the system that we have. But the challenges are that because it's time bound, you can only do it within a snapshot of time, and even the licensing process has to come to an end at a particular point, but issues are continuously evolving, so that's a challenge. But on to your question about how do we get experts to be more sensitive to the local context? I think there are very many aspects to this question, but the first issue is getting the right technical people to undertake the EIA process. For example, if I'm an expert in issues of hydrology, and maybe I'm dealing with undertaking the EIA in an area that is, say, wildlife sensitive, I may not have the technical capability to be able to undertake an EIA that will be taking into full consideration the, say, wildlife issues. So the EIA or the proponent needs to understand that for a project like this, it needs to really have a good, strong team of experts that will have, say, hydrologists to address the water issues, or EIA experts that are dealing with wildlife issues. So they'll bring on board an ecologist in an area where there's lots of crowded people. You need to have a social expert. So I think we need to, the sensitivity will come on board when we have an EIA team that is technically competent in the issues that need to be addressed at the particular phase of the project. So that, I think, is the most critical. Of course, in addition to making sure that the EIA's experts that you're dealing with are technically competent to undertake the work. Thank you. I'm not sure if that has answered the question. Thank you, Lucy.
Linda, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Lucy.
Great. I had your response. I'm really sorry that my network is very choppy, and understood about getting the right professionals for the right scope of work. But I think one of the comments was that sometimes the people don't even fully understand what the project is about. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the role of the EIA expert, but they do need to have a view of to what extent is that public really understanding the issue that is being discussed at hand. Is the development project already something they were aware was happening? Maybe that relates to some of the administrative authorities on the ground. But we need to think about that, and also think about their independence. They are proponents. As proponents, they are paid by the proponent of the project, and there's always question about their objectivity and transparency. So just wondering whether you would like to speak to that, and whether the experts themselves see that as a potential area of compromise, where they are answerable to the project proponent, even though they're meant to give an independent assessment of the impact of that project. Would you have any quick thoughts on that?
Thank you, Lucy. And that's a really important and valid discussion. And this comes up quite a bit in many of the projects that we undertake. And yes, that's quite a big challenge, because you'll find that the structure of the EIA setup in our country is that the EIA proponent is hired by the contractor or by the project proponent, and the expectations are very high. So you'll see that people may not understand, or proponents and the public in general have not understood the importance of the EIA process. That this process is supposed to flag out environmental and social issues that can present a problem in this particular project. So I think the biggest problem is that proponents, including, say, government, they see for government projects, this is a thing that people want to get done. This is SGR project. This is one of the goals that we have to attain for Vision 2030. Therefore, this project has to go through. And in that, at that time, an EIA, the process is seen as a box we have to tick so that NEMA can give the approval, the license, so that the project can proceed. So sometimes it can be quite challenging when the EIA expert is flagging out the issues that need to be addressed. So we have a few proponents that understand, or those projects, for example, that are funded, say, by World Bank, who have very strict criteria for environmental and social considerations to be undertaken. So you'll find that those ones, the project proponent will be very close to the EIA practitioner, and will really want the practitioner to highlight the issues and how we will address these issues. And they're really keen on making sure that these issues are addressed. But for some projects, you'll just find that this is a thing that we want to do. We want, NEMA just to give us a license and we can proceed. So that presents a real challenge for EIA practitioners. So we really have to relook probably at the way that the EIA process is undertaken, so that the proponent has to come to an understanding that this is a real process that has to flag out environmental issues, so that EIA experts don't feel the pressure of, okay, I have to kind of magnify the good bits of this project and kind of tone down the disadvantages of this project in a manner that NEMA will give an approval of the license. So yes, I admit that that is a challenge that that we face, but again, as I said in the beginning, that the EIA system is not a perfect process as it is currently set up, and there are many studies going on all over the world to try and see how the EIA system can be improved. But yes, I agree that this is a challenge that we face as proponents, as EIA practitioners, and that proponents or project implementers have not yet understood that EIA is a real genuine process that is there to flag out and address issues. And as a result, you find that projects end up facing all these negative challenges, demonstrations, people reject the project. You can even find the communities directly sabotaging projects. So those are kind of the things that come up after, say, a license has been issued and the proponent is now having problems with the project long after the EIA expert has completed the process, and as a result, NEMA has issued a license, and then the proponent is left holding the baby, literally. So I think these are things that it's good that we're discussing so that they can be flagged out for addressing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda, for being very also, again, candid and open about the challenges. I like what I'm hearing, that there's room for improving the EIA process. And so the spotlight is now going to be on Marian. You hold the answer to all these issues. How do we improve that process? How do we improve the framework? How do we create transparency and objectivity between the experts and the proponent? I think we're cognizant of the challenges, so we will not belabor those, but I'm looking at you and hoping you can suggest what you as NEMA would like to see done differently, and what we as the outsiders who always blame NEMA for all the licenses that get approved that we don't think should be approved, and we go to court and we go to the streets, we really need to hear from you and look for some pragmatic options that are workable. Over to you, Marian.
Thank you very much, Lucy. I hope everybody can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. That's a bit scary when you say you're looking at me to have all the answers, because I don't think I have all the answers. I can also just give my opinion or the way I look at this. But yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to thank Tobias for the wonderful presentation. For sure, I must say that is quite informative, and I agree with most of what he has shared, because we live in this country, we know what is happening. We have seen the implementation of this project. So yes, we appreciate the challenges that we face, and that is fine. If you would allow me, I start by correcting my title. I am not a director. I am a chief environmental officer in charge of environmental impact assessments.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so just back to the topic of the day. One thing is we appreciate, like Linda has already alluded to, that EI may not be the answer to the public participation, just because that's the main issue that we are talking about here, to our public participation. I mean, addressing the concerns that go with public participation and of course the environmental assessment in general. And I think I just want to go a notch higher and say, because based on even what Tobias presented, is that the LAPSSET had better participation, had better engagement than the SGR. And I would want to say it's because, one, the LAPSSET was subjected to strategic environmental assessment, unlike the SGR, which was a project. So our strategic environmental assessment process is a bit more engaging, provides room for more engagement. And that is how the LAPSSET came out stronger on public participation than the SGR. So one of my suggestions would be, if we can embrace strategic environmental assessment, and this mainly goes to us as the government, because if most of these projects were planned better, and they were anchored into a plan or a program, then it becomes easier to subject those projects, or rather those plans and programs, to strategic environmental assessment as provided for under the amendment of 2015, section 57A of MCA. Because like he rightly said, unlike EIA, where we only do public participation at the information level, I know, like Linda has said, okay, was it Linda? Or someone has said, I think it was Lucy, who when you said that most of the respondents were saying that they would only get some information, but had no time to interrogate and, even get feedback. Unfortunately, our legal requirement, and that maybe that's the other thing, I know we have a robust legal process, but still there's something that can be done about the legal requirements for the EIA process, because for EIA, we only provide information. And this starts with the experts, because they will have a meeting or two where they will go and, just tell the people this project is coming up and that's it. Or worse still, they will do questionnaires, one-on-one consultations, which may not provide adequate information for the people to make informed decisions or to make reasonable comments to the project. Unfortunately, it just ends there. The other one is, the other provision would be the advertisements that we put in the newspapers. And that way, how many, especially the local communities, do not have access to these newspapers, to a one-off radio announcement, which someone might have missed out, depending on the time that it was done, to a gazette notice, which maybe a few people would have access to. So unfortunately, the EI process, the consultation at the EI process is very limited. And hence, if we could embrace the SEA, which allows now, like Tobias already presented, allows an opportunity for what we call a stakeholder validation workshop. After the consultations have been done, another meeting is held. In that way, people have an opportunity, because the provision is that you need to inform the community or the stakeholders how their concerns have been integrated. So if we can improve on because like Linda said, the EI process is time bound. it is site specific, it is time bound. We may not have the luxury of time to do all that engagement. So for me, one, I'm fronting the SCA, where we have plans and programs being subjected to strategic environmental assessment. So we have opportunities for engagement and also opportunities for more information being provided. Again, the legislative requirement, like I have mentioned, where we can have more opportunities. I mean, go beyond giving information. We need to be able to get an opportunity for the community to get feedback, for us to be able to allow them to express or rather understand why we are making the decisions we are making, because unfortunately, and why many a times cases are lost because we have followed the law. And as long as we have followed the law to the letter, we are okay as NEMA because we are a regulator. But if we would go beyond complying with the law and allowing for appropriate engagement, proper engagement, then that would again solve a number of our problems. I am also agreeing with the issue of capacity, and capacity cuts across. Capacity for the expert, like Linda has already said, capacity at NEMA level, because of course we also have our limitations in terms of resources, how much we can engage. Because if I would use a good example is that we have seen that public hearings are good opportunities where the communities or the project affected persons get an opportunity to express their opinions, and they get an opportunity to get answers, because NEMA is present. NEMA does the invitations. We make sure that all the project affected persons are covered. So, or rather they are captured and they are able to attend the meetings. And they have some liberty of not being under pressure, not being under anyone's instructions, to be able to express their opinions and even get immediate answers. But again, if I would just give an example, looking at the budget for a public hearing, one would not cost less than $500,000. So unless the authority has enough resources to be able to do that, then it becomes a bit of a challenge. So yeah, that's still another opportunity where which we can explore. The other issue I have seen, it's about, even as Tobias was presenting, the level of awareness of the communities or the project affected persons. I know we have in collaboration with other agencies like the WWF, we have tried to develop a community guide on public participation. But my other question would be, even in this forum, how many of us are aware? How much have we disseminated this information? Because we have realized is that many a time,
your mic has muted, I think. Marian?
no.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, I just saw, yeah. So
maybe you can also be wrapping up. Yes.
Yes, let me just wrap up. So what I was saying is most of the community members, unfortunately, will come to a meeting not knowing what is expected of them and what rights or what opportunity do they have for them to express their opinion. And this many a times will even be affected by a situation where somebody has promised them, when you come for the meeting, I'll give you transport home, I'll give you food, I'll give you what. So their contributions to the project is skewed or is affected by what reason brought them there. So there is a lot of need for capacity building, even for the communities, to ensure that they understand what is expected of them, what they need to do, and I mean, also not to be bound by whoever has brought them in. And I will not overemphasize the political influence, because for sure some of these projects are targets for the government and they need to be done, and it becomes a bit difficult to deal with them even as government officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian. I also must thank you for being very candid and very honest about the realities of the challenges. And what I'm hearing from the three panelists is that not only are they acknowledging the challenges, they actually have very good insights into where the challenges are emerging from and even opportunities for us to improve. I'm hearing Marian saying we can insist on SEAs for programs and plans, not just selectively, so that there's a more rigorous process. I'm hearing comments on capacity, both for technical agencies and for communities, to understand what really are they commenting on? What are their rights around the topic? Sometimes there's a lot of intimidation and they think they're not allowed to speak. I think every one of these speakers has talked about political influence. It's the big elephant in the room that no one knows what to do with it, yet we cannot ignore it because we must develop in a sustainable manner. And so I feel that we have just begun what ought to be probably a whole day discussion on ways to move forward. And so my suggestion, because we are out of time, is to suggest that we pick the things you have all identified here as recommendations and find a follow-up forum where we actually try and articulate where we take those recommendations, whether it's a reviewing of our processes, the SEA being embedded in programs and plans across the country. I would have wanted to also hear your thoughts on the mitigation hierarchy as a framework that can be used by EIA experts and within our SEAs to avoid impact, minimize, restore, and offset. I think we're talking about the independence of the EIA experts. How do we embed that in our legislation? There's a lot that needs to be done, but I think I'm also hearing there is some things that we can do if we know the right entry points to push and advocate for these suggestions. So I would like to suggest, and I've put that on the chat, if people can post, we are going to save all the questions you've put here that may not have been addressed because we're out of time. But I think the suggestions made today cannot be left just as suggestions from a webinar. I'd like to suggest that we have a forum with these same great 3 panelists and really panel beat some solutions and then have a strategy to have those followed through in a practical manner, whether it's to reviewing legislation or providing capacity or providing frameworks that are integrated. And also beginning to think about how do we get our politicians to appreciate that these processes are good for people, good for the country, good for them, so they can allow the processes to be followed to their due conclusion. So this would be my suggestion, and I don't know what my panelists think about that, and Tobias, whether that would be a good way to go forward and create a forum and a platform to actually have these as agencies now in their official capacity, really see how we embed the recommendations that are coming out of this. Any one comment on that before we wrap up, Tobias or the panelists?
No, I think I agree with you totally on that. Let's take this to the next level. And I think the forum already creates a very important foundation for that.
Excellent.